Start recording. Okay. The very first poem I've ever encountered was Dirge Without Music by Edna St. Vincent Millay, contained in the 1995 children's novel Baby by Patricia McLachlan in the Italian translation. I remember being stunned at the curious arrangement on the page, what I didn't know were lines and stanzas. I had never seen poetry on the page, only prose. James Logan Back maintains that, quote, more than meter, more than rhyme, more than images or alliteration or figurative language, line is what distinguishes our experience of poetry as poetry, end quote. Before that moment, I had crucially never seen a poetic line. In fact, I did not know that such a thing existed. And even though, quote, the line's function is sonic, and its function cannot be understood merely from its visual appearance on the page, end quote, seeing it was crucial for me to make sense of what I was already certainly hearing in song and nursery rhymes and lullabies. Borrowing from the language of autoethnography, that moment was an epiphany. It was a turning point that redefined my understanding of myself and of the world. And with all of the poetry that I have since read in translation from many languages, it strikes me profoundly that this first awakening happened through translation in the language that I would come to choose some 15 years later. I started writing poetry in English at some point between my late teens and early 20s, which is more than 15 years ago. I have no specific date for when it happened, only a set of very vivid memories and a string of weird self-translated poems from the Italian, full of calques and mistakes. There was no pressing real reason for this. I had only vaguely starting to think about moving to the UK. So I can only make sense of my actions as a response to an attraction, something that I couldn't resist, something that is very close to falling in love, on innamoramento, which is a common experience among exophonic writers, that is to say, writers who write in a no-native tongue. I had a great teacher in high school who introduced me to the classics, and off of that, I went looking for more literature in English. As a teenager, I loved Stein and Plath and Woolf and Dickinson and then Kathy Archer. And compared to the very male, very 19th century Italian literature I was studying in school, these works seemed impossibly exciting. And because of them, I identified a kind of formal freedom with the English language. And by the time I moved to London after my undergraduate, I had found Ariana Rines and C.D. Wright and Anne Carson and Anna Mendelssohn and countless other authors and poets, and my heart was set. I was going to write in English. English has been the dominant language of my writing since. Over the years, I have occasionally blended some Italian into my performance work, especially when working in collaboration with other European poets. However, this was rare and not something I have consciously sought out, but something that I would normally be asked to do. Yet, of course, Italian was always there, like an undercurrent. And every time I would write or read in Italian, something felt very different, although not always necessarily easier. So I have kind of started to look back and think about what I call the problem of my two languages only in the last couple of years. And an invitation, maybe a year and a half ago at this point, to contribute to a poetry series called Autopoetica, which is curated by poet and academic Marzia D'Amico on Italian literary publication Argo Online, made it clear how much I needed to think about it. Because when I tried to write in Italian, I realized I couldn't. At least I couldn't do it directly. I seemed, to my astonishment, only able to write in my first language if I had an English version alongside it, sometimes even just as a phantom limb, a scrap of a line. There's a critical commentary accompanying that publication, which I eventually managed to write. And there I say, quote, "Every time I write directly in Italian, I still feel that I must go through English." So in these texts, I tried to do away with the assumption that one language works better than the other. And I nominated self-translation as a practice, not corrosive, but certainly chemical. And the resulting texts are sometimes twins, other times they're only distant relatives. I found that taking turns with the source language means getting rid of meanings around one's identity, making the problem of non-belonging in both directions into a possibility. A radical hypothesis which rejects monolingualism, monoculture, and market. The experiment started to puncture a series of ideas that I had held in my time since moving, both geographically and kind of in terms of my writing practice, moving to English. The first idea that it started to undo was the idea that I could possibly compartmentalize, so seal off one of my two languages when writing in the other. And it also prodded at the notion of owning a language in the first place, or even truly belonging to a language once and for all, as something that is a monolith, something static. Exophony, so this condition of writing in a language that is not my mother tongue, makes this impossibility of really owning a language, something that Derrida talks about in Monolingualism of the Other, more apparent. And it makes it apparent how translation is a permanent feature of the writing process for somebody who's an exophonic writer. The work of exophonic writers, in other words, quote, "philosophically speaking, is always already the product of translation." The astonishing thing is that it would happen both ways, so that somewhere along the way, my second language would reclaim such a large role in my relationship to my first. It's the mysterious feeling I have sometimes when, as I look for a word in either language, I find myself grasping at a sense of language that is somehow and inexplicably in itself bilingual. So I guess this paper, this work in progress thinking, is about whether this position, the position of the exophonic writer that becomes the bilingual writer, can be a literary project, can be something done publicly, programmatically. And I've been thinking about the assumptions that would accompany its reception and what kind of listening can or should be reserved for such texts. During my time in the UK, I specialized in voice work. Specializing in voice work has really sealed my identity as somebody who writes and speaks in English and augmented my sense of agency within their language system. My voice training, which is situated firmly within the performing arts rather than the literary arts, has granted me a unique interdisciplinary perspective when looking at writing. Thinking and working through the body helped me develop a habit of editing through voice or editing out loud, whereby voice is, as Fred Moten puts it, quote, "an eruption of phonic substance that cuts and augments meaning." Practical work grounded in physiology, grounded in thinking about the body, has added a whole new dimension to my thinking around language, writing, and vocal affects. So what voice does, let's say. I cannot understand writing as a disembodied activity any longer. And quoting Charles Olson, it is crucial to undo the, quote, "removal of verse from its producer and its reproducer, the voice," end quote, and understand breath, speech, and language as something that work as working together in an open composition. Olson talks about the kinetic energy of a poem, the energy of a poem, as something that is made solid through speech, thus becoming as tangible as the objects of reality. So in this kind of world-making activity, you have the poem, the speaker of the poem, that is the imagined voice of the poem, and also the reader of the poem, which speaks and listens with absolute singularity in the uniqueness of their voice, as well as the reader-listener and the myriad ways that they assign meaning to what they're hearing. So if by voice I refer to the bodily, the performative, and the discursive all at once, every linguistic choice I make taps into and interferes with notions around subjectivity, subject formation, belonging, and it complicates all these sets of expectations around identity and language that can feel sometimes like something inevitable, a path. So something that is determined by one's voice, again, physical and metaphorical. In my thinking, I've encountered the work of First Nations multidisciplinary artist and choreographer Amrita Epi, who talks of destiny. And she talks of destiny not as a facile notion, but as a useful concept in the arts that refers to, quote, the invisible or visible forces that propel one to do what they do and make the choices that they're making. And destiny, according to Epi, is closely linked to agency, to intent, and to purpose. So what are the forces, visible and invisible, that make me or anyone else do what I do vocally as a writer who performs her own work, and how to think about my own agency in relation to them? How to navigate legibility, reception, and notions of authenticity as I operate in relation to such forces. How to overcome the sense of one's work being spurious, misplaced, opaque, or unpublishable. I find that the performance moment is a testing ground in which these forces are interrogated, performed, and prodded. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read from the publication on Argo Online in Autopoetica and offer a brief comment. So the first poem is called Il fatto della testa in affanno. Siamo contrarie all'insistenza del mercato nei confronti di ognuna, in passaggio dal deli sotto l'arco al marciapiede, dal piano di sotto all'imbocco del cocktail, dalla stanza di lacca alla birra mielosa, dal contratto al confine bagnato del parco, da rosa alba al beige di protesta. Ci affanna la visione appannata, il prisma multilenze, la mano, dove c'era un tirapugni. Ci esauriscono i 24 denti e ognuno ripennellato. Ci stanca la collinetta di coccio, il vagone del premio, la bella donna nel bicchiere, il languore infinito. Ci ammorbidiscono il cotone sulla lingua, la bocca piena, le scintille nel microfono, lo spacco a proposito del tempo. Which in English is the fact of the short-winded mind. We disagree with this insistence of the market on each one. She goes from the deli to the pavement, from the basement to the mouth of cocktails, from enamel room to honey beer, from contract to park wet borders, from pink dawn to green protest. It weakens us, it clouds our vision, the multi-lens prism, the knuckle duster that once was on the hand. It runs out of 24 teeth, each one getting recoated. It bores us, the terracotta hill, the award wagon, belladonna in the glass, an infinity of languor. It blunts us, the cotton on the tongue, the mouthful, the microphone scintillas, the split that is said about time. So I'm going to read two more in pairs. So the next one is called Christmas Flatlands. You try to stay put on this plane that sways and boogies. Your deliberations, your attempts at competence. It's so fragmented here in the wide berth incline of a city that feels open to you. Its linens, its beautiful pillars, the sweet sand, a whole walk under the earth, And yes, you say, anything can be anything else when one is able to hope in the face of the earthquake, the perfect musical rumble that's coming to squash left, right, and center, to round you up and make you go in style and carriage like through showers, through and out, into the slap of city, out, into this salt of wanting, sex, this cringe and feast, this rigmarole of distance. In Italian. Festività. Cerchi di stare dritta su questa piana che ondula e balla, le tue delibere, i tentativi di competenza. È tutto in pezzi qui, nel pendio pericoloso della città che ti sembra aperta, i suoi filati, le sue bellissime colonne, la sua sabbia dolce, è una camminata intera sottoterra. E certo, dice adesso, che ogni cosa può essere ogni altra quando si è capaci di speranza, in faccia al terremoto perfetto che raduna e spinge fuori, con stile, in pompa magna, nel risciacquo e poi di fuori, nello schianto di città, così, di fuori, nella voglia che ti punge fino a dentro, fino al tuo procedimento alla distanza. The last one, sobolitura. Come l'ape che ronza sui vetri, disco rotto del cielo. Nella stanza chiara e boreale, accesi e viola, crescevano i quadernetti dei miei versi. Una forma che si sgrana e non si può dire, o accennare, un attimo, appoggiati al vetro nero. E anche quando si riconosce alla donna un'anima, un'altra si sdoppia, un ricordo gigantesco. La stessa notte, facendo lo stesso sogno, convinte che fosse così terribile. Poaching. Like a bee buzzing on glass in the busted orbit, in the aureole room, spooling lit and purple, oh, form that unravels and cannot be spoken, spooling smoky pain. And even when a woman is given a soul, another one splits and doubles in the enormous recollection. The same night, having the same dream, convinced it must be so terrible. As I read these poems, I feel that all of my cultural articulations are brought forth, my privileges shifting and morphing as I travel between the two languages. There is my hard to place Europeanness as I speak in English, my regional accent in Italian, with its inconsistent adherence to Italian dizione. There is an open space between the written/translated and the spoken, and there language is stretched and then put to rest. And the workings of the body, the breathing, have gotten in the way, of course, when writing and translating. For example, in the first poem, The Fact of the Short-Winded Mind, in the English version, there are extra spaces in the middle of the line of certain lines that result in more audible breaths or audible breaths when I read it out loud. Festività feels all about vowels, and I feel that my voice seems to go softer and higher pitched when I read it. In the second half of the final pair that I read, sobolitura/poaching, the two languages seem to have multiplied and kind of sprouted from each other. For example, la stanza chiara e boreale would literally translate as the bright and boreal room. Instead, in translation, it has become the aureole room, rhyming with the potential of its own literal translation, and thus generating a third image, a third world of sound and imagery. The O in poaching is only an idea. It's a possibility of a release, and it doesn't occur in sobolitura. It couldn't in the Italian version. And then the two poems join together again in the final scene of the dream. poems that are twins, and twins that dream in poems. So in conclusion, Brown and Labelle calls the, quote, vocal link back to the corporeal a ground for agency. It is the process by which the voice is understood as an articulation of personhood, however unstable, to tense the relation between the forces of objectification and the demand for subjectivity. In choosing to translate myself and to posit myself as a bilingual writer, I complicate a fundamental fact of my biography and create a third space and a third feeling against, or in conversation, perhaps, these forces of objectification. And it's not so much between the two poles exactly, English and Italian, and not exactly a third thing, but it is an in-between, it is a borderland. It is a space for negotiation between fate and agency, a space for alien tones and invention. Against the sense of inevitability of one's vocal, so physical and metaphorical destiny, encompassing the sonic trajectories of my voice, its ever-changing physical life, and the narrative arcs of my figurative textual voice. The two registers, I feel, meet in translation and in performance, in their plurality of incarnations and interconnections. It's an Italian-infused English, an English-infused Italian, a borrowing, a doubling, an impersonation, a liberation. And my writer's life, or my life, is an effect of their space in between and all that happens there. And to conclude with Lynn Eginian, quote, I was eventually to become one person, gathered up maybe during a pause at a comma. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Serena. That was amazing and brilliant. We now ask Allison, when she will be done with taking notes, because I noticed that you were taking lots of notes, to please offer her commentary as a respondent.
Thank you, Serena. That was beautiful and so rich. So many thoughts. I was frantically taking notes, actually. Yeah, thank you for having me, Marzia, and Nicola, and Armando, and there was someone else, and I don't remember her name. But yeah, it's really an honor to be here online, especially because, Serena, your work is so, I feel very emotionally connected to you through it. I think we have so much in common. And I wanted to start off by saying, as you were speaking, I couldn't stop thinking about Hélène Cixous and The Laugh of the Medusa. It seems like a text you could have possibly written. You know, like those texts that we go back and they end up writing us in a way. And thinking about, I have a lot of questions / comments, thinking about not only multilingualism and nationality, but the role of gender in voice, and the use of different languages and the gendering of different languages and how those come across also within your writing. Because this idea of destiny within language it's a destiny that we make, let's say, around our voice and the languages we use to a large extent. Obviously, some things are beyond our control. And I think that's also what Cixous is talking about. So I wonder for you then, where the limit of control is when we create a voice, whether that's the physical voice or the poetic voice of writing. But I'm really interested in so many different aspects of what you brought up. So I thought I'd start from the beginning of my notes. And this idea of the poetic line is really interesting to me, especially that you brought up Charles Olson, because I think he revolutionized English language poetry in that essay from 1950. So it's not a new essay by any means. It's 75 years old. And it's an essay I turn to often because it's there that he says a line, because I fully agree with you mentioned a quote of someone saying that a poem is defined by the use of the line, I think, right? And I really agree with that. And Olson says that a line then is defined by the use of breath, and how we determine the length of the line by the length of the breath, so that it's always worthwhile to listen to the actual poet reading their work, because then we understand the poem in a different way. So I'm curious, because as I was looking at your translations, this was really exciting to me, especially in the poem that you read, the first one, I believe, Il fatto della testa in affanno, the fact of the short-winded mind. The lines are different, the line breaks are different. And I found this really exciting for a number of reasons. First of all, because it gave me a huge revolutionary moment where I realized, because Marzia mentioned in my bio, I translated a book by the Bologna-based poet Vito Bonito, who's a living poet, an amazing poet, who has really short lines. And because he's alive, I worked with him, and I was really obsessed with maintaining the length of the line. Like, that seemed like something in the translation of poetry that I needed to stick to. Like, I made this rule up for myself, right? Like, we all choose different rules and different methods and different obsessions when we translate, I think, like what stands in for being the most important thing. And by translating yourself and changing the lines, it feels like you're giving the freedom to actually say no, because the breath might be different in each language. And so there's some need to respect that. So I'm really curious to know how you deal with this in each language. And if you found that the length of the line, the breadth of the line for you in composition is different in each language, and how you navigate that space, whether that's in translation or when you're writing directly in the poems. I don't know, you've just like done something, you've opened some important place for the changing my thinking about poetry translation there. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about this concept, I think, of falling in love with a foreign language and being an exophonic writer, because you and I previously spoke a bit about this, that I think language is as hard as we try not to give them a personal hierarchy, let's say, they tend to fall back into different hierarchies, whether those are social political hierarchies or personal hierarchies. So I wonder a bit why you feel this formal freedom in English that you mentioned. Does it come from your own personal history with your first language of Italian? Does it come from the history of English itself, which is, an extremely global language that is perhaps, because of this, very porous, even though it resists constantly? And I was also wondering, I guess, how you deal with the fact, because English is also, politically speaking, too powerful, in my opinion, and it's my first language. And so how do we deal with adopting a language that is so, maybe bellicose is the word, or do languages have characteristics, I guess, like, maybe not, maybe we should treat them, I don't think we can treat languages as neutral spaces, but maybe language is more innocent than the speakers of it, so maybe that's something. But I was thinking of Beckett when you were reading Beckett in French, like this idea that you can experiment much more in a foreign tongue than in your own, which is something I personally struggle with. So I'm really, I admire and I'm fascinated by your ability to do so. I think also I was thinking a bit about, and this was really exciting to me, what you were talking about, the undercurrents of Italian in your writing. And I was thinking of a number of texts that are for me like those texts that I continually return to and admire. One being the work of Alice Ceresa, because she wrote in Italian all her life, but she was bilingual. She was born in Basel but raised in Bellinzona and then lived in Rome. And so her Italian always has like a German kind of shadow, a German ghost, let's say. And I'm also thinking of, there's a really great book by Uliana Wolf with Sophie Saita, German and English, in which they disrupt the idea of there ever being an original to begin with, because it's co-written. And so the languages start fusing together. And even if you don't fluently read one of those languages, you pick it up via context. And I wonder if this happens in your work in a way that sometimes you don't necessarily see it coming. Like when you're composing something, do the languages blend beyond your control? And what do you do about that? Do do you attempt to control it, or do you let them reign free? And I guess that gets to my other question about self-translation, because I find it really difficult to understand conceptually self-translation, because I think translating poetry is already difficult, and I think completely possible. I really don't like it when, you know, there's the argument that you think you can't translate poetry. Of course you can. You can translate everything, because words are a translation immediately. But what is your process like? And when you're translating a poem, do you feel like you run the risk of completely writing a new poem each time? Because that's the sensation I have in my mind, is that if I were going to translate something of my own, I would just write a different poem, like because the experience would be different in each language. And so I'm curious about like the choices you make, and I think the different performative aspects of yourself that come into that, because writing is a performance of a persona. Translation then is a doubly layered. You know, the layers only increase as we pack and unpack language. So those are some things. I think I was also kind of curious about your feelings, your thoughts about, and this is kind of drifting off into a different area, maybe, I'm not sure. Since you're trained with your voice and a different vocal technique, how you feel about the performance of the poem itself via the voice. Maybe going back a little bit to Olson, this idea of, you know, the poet needs to read to really understand the poem, which is interesting because in English, there's poets read their poems, right? Like you go somewhere and the poets read the poems. I found it in Italian context quite often, they will ask actors to read the poems, which makes me angry.
Yeah.
But I wonder what you think of authentic voice and like where your voice comes from. But yeah.
Yeah, if I may jump in, I've been trying to
Please do.
scribbling furiously because I mean,
I'm happy to repeat her.
The series of questions was so brilliant. So thank you for that. So okay, let's just start just because it's fresh in my mind, this thing about authenticity and in a way, so kind of answering or touching upon two questions. So you asked to know more about my sense of falling in love, and what you just mentioned, the different tradition and the different understanding, public understanding and artistic understanding in the culture of poetry is something that definitely drew me to an Anglo, you know, English speaking context of some kind. You know, I didn't necessarily know it was going to be the UK. It ended up being the UK. Would have, you know, the States would have made much more sense in terms of where my mind was, but you know, practicalities in life, and it feels very far away. Yeah, so that was definitely something, knowing that there was a place where a poetry reading was as exciting as a live gig. And I discovered this at some point. I think there was an article in Vogue when I was about 17. I had this period when I was subscribed to Vogue Italia. Just a very funny fact. I just loved the dresses, you know, I just loved it. And there was this article about Kate Tempest. And I can't remember who wrote the article. It was an Italian, you know, it was a great article. And so I discovered Kate Tempest, and I discovered about readings, and I was completely excited. And I mean, this is also self-mythologizing. Maybe I've heard about readings also somewhere else, but I remember that very, very strongly. And I was like, oh, in London, oh, that's a thing. This is a thing that happens. And so I feel that my innamoramento, my falling in love, was very much circumstantial, in the sense of like anecdotal, or like what happened to me, and where I felt that I could find a place where I could make sense. So we go into kind of deeply personal identity stuff, you know, and I've been singing since I was 6 in choir, because singing was always part of my family and my life. So voice has always been there. But it wasn't that, as much as I love singing. So it was voice in another way. And what was that way? And it's still puzzling to me, and I still find it hard to explain it to people. How is it that the voice, what happens when a poem is read out loud? And why, if an actor does it, I also, with you, tend to cringe. That to me is such a huge misunderstanding. Or simply a different thing. It is a different, it's a different event. It does something that is different. I lost my thread for a second. So yeah, so I guess also that's why I'm so interested in thinking about this through autoethnography and auto theory, and kind of, because it's so entrenched for me, and because I'm also so green as a researcher, that I'm making sense of it through lived experience in such a profound way. And this idea of destiny and all the forces, all the circumstances, and what do you do in terms of what do you decide to do? So this kind of takes me to your question about self-translation. And I guess where my thinking is at is that self-translation is not the same as bilingual writing. Self-translation can be a practice, or can be part of a practice. And in the past year and a half, I've tried. But once again, the forces that compel or propel, I have tried because I couldn't write the poems. So Marcia invited me very kindly, and I couldn't write in Italian. So this is not even me trying something out. This is a practical problem. It's a writer's block. And of course, something that impressed me profoundly, that impressed me in the Italian way, the word I'm looking for is, made a big impression on me, because it's my first language. So when I say self-translation can be a practice, I just mean more perhaps a tool in the toolbox of your practice. But I don't think I can go back to not having done it. So I have done it. Something interesting happened with that. The poems are definitely linked. So if I ever had to expand on that series, maybe make it into a longer thing, they would be linked, because they need to be linked. Otherwise, it's like balloons; they just fly away. As you said, "Oh, I'm worried that a self-translated poem will just be another thing."
But I think it's like to me it's a positive risk almost, though, right? Like it's a good risk. Like if it happens, it's okay. At least in my, yeah.
I guess it depends on what you want to do, and also your very first question was about the breathing and the breathing differently, which I thought was so insightful. Actually, you managed to articulate something that I was trying to wrap my head around, because I do believe that we breathe differently in different languages. And it's not just about timbre or tone. So there are things that I notice when I speak in Italian or English that have to do with sound. They're very apparent to me. Now, of course, the way that I hear my voice through bone and air is not the same way that you hear my voice. You could never, we know this, right? So it's an impossibility. It's like seeing yourself the way that you are seen. It's a perceptual impossibility. So I don't know what it is that happens when I when I read in the two languages. But you made me think of physiology. So one way of understanding vocal production and breath is that the column of air, let's call it, is chopped up into mini units, pulsations, right? According to what the message is going to be. So now I'm talking to you, and my system is chopping up the air so that I can utter the words that I want to utter. And it happens live. It's not a pre-made message, because I don't know. I roughly know what I want to say, but I don't know. It's not ready. So it happens as it happens. You need to speak it for it to happen.
Yeah.
Right? Which in a way is what Derrida talks about in monolingualism. Talking, it's impossible to own a language because of the act of speaking.
Yeah.
Which is another text that I keep going back to and not understanding.
Also for me, it's a huge important text for me as well. Like obsessively reading that essay.
So yeah, I lost my thread again, but
I actually have a question related to what you're saying about physiology, because this was like a question as you were reading. I was also thinking about, tied to this idea of the composition of the line, and I'm wondering how you compose, because like for me, I sometimes write, but I often make poem. I'll like start with an idea or start with a line, and I recite it over and over again. I do a lot of I walk around making WhatsApp messages to myself of poems. Like I really like the way words sound in my mouth when I make a poem. Like it's very much based on what you're saying, right? The improvisation of the words coming via breath in a certain way. So I wonder if you find the actual composition of the poems to be different for you in each language, and if you have different, let's call them, let's say, literary devices in each language. Because one of my favorite words in Italian and in English is the idea of like ronza, buzz, like the use of onomatopoeia in a given language, the use of assonance and consonants. Do you find like each language, do you go to different things? Are different things interesting to you in each language based on sound and bodily response, let's say? Like what is your composition process in relation to each, and also relating to the body, if that makes sense? It's a question.
It's a very interesting question. And I have to say, I haven't written in Italian recently enough to really have a sense. So to really have a proper answer to this question. I think there are things that I am attracted to in the two languages, and they're very different. And this is what we discussed when we had that discussion pre today. And I was telling you about the beats in English. So beat of beat versus the syllables in Italian. And so the two languages feel to me completely different. And
since you told me that, I can't stop thinking about it.
It is so cool. I love it. Also, incidentally, if anybody wants to learn English, I feel that is the one thing they need to understand. Weak forms. The fact that it's not all the syllables have the same weight. And if you come from a Romance language, that will blow your mind. You will go like, okay, I can do it now. At least that's what it was for me and what I do as a voice teacher. And I find that really helps. But I digress. So I feel different in the two languages. Because speech sounds feel different. And I also I have voice memos. Voice memos on my phone a lot. So I do that. I have a sense. I don't have I couldn't describe my process in terms of writing poetry. I find it very, very difficult to pinpoint. It is a sense of something. I know it sounds frustratingly like, oh, it's the muse that comes and traverses me. It's not that, but it is a sense of something. It's an intuition. And what I'm interested in is what can I put in place for that to happen? And so this thing about the two languages, it's almost like the experience of translating myself now, as I said before, I don't feel I can go back. And now I feel that I want to kind of decide what is it that I'm doing, and in what languages am I, in what language am I doing it? And I'm very interested in the sense, an idea of energy and momentum and intent. Yeah, and purpose, and therefore like having a project and going like, and then within that you can be free, I guess. Yeah.
It made me think of, when you were speaking of, there's Stephen King has a really, I don't know if he wrote a great book about writing called On Writing. It's like, it's a great book.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a Stephen King fan at all, but like I respect him a great deal. This book is in it, he says something along the lines of basically like, it's just when I think of composition, because it is an impossible question, but he talks about like having a vision of like something that's under mud, basically. Like it'll be like one line or he has one image, and it's like it all comes from this place. And like everything else, it's like digging up. The rest of the work is basically digging up that thing and trying to figure out what it is, like brushing it off. You know, like if you have like this one sentence in your head or this one image that you know will come back in a poem, it just made me think of that. I just got distracted. But
it's interesting that we both seem to have the same relationship to almost sounding it out. I think sounding it out is something that is part of how children learn to read. Is that correct in English? Yeah.
There's always sounding out, because you're absolutely right. The way that English is the syllables. That's the only, although, sounding out is funny because we know that it's not a very phonetically honest language, English. So you can sound it out, but then you have to know which sounds the sounds make. So before, I was just thinking of I'm currently in Oslo today, bizarrely, and I met an artist here with a project I feel like you would really like, and that's what I wanted. Her name is Mette Evidsen, and she has a project where she invites people to memorize entire books and rewrite them. And the amount of people who do this is incredible, but a lot of them memorize the books aloud and then will do this also like in public. And I'm just thinking of the idea of reading and writing aloud and the difference it makes between silence and sound. And I think also thinking about, like when we were saying, you know, in Italy, actors read poems at readings sometimes. And it is different, but I think it bothers me because I really do believe in what Olson says about the breath, like my energy to you, right? This concept of energy. But I also think it has to do with how you compose something, because if how you compose something is so tied to your bodily experience of the words in your own body, it makes a big difference that you read it. If you're more of a graphic person, who's more interested in the graphic aspect of writing, then maybe it doesn't matter so much. I'm like, it just, yeah,
it is an interesting one. I think working in the performing arts, the thing that I find very interesting is that it seems to be a binary. There seems to be a binary around, I'm not even sure how to describe it, but something around craft versus authenticity. And so if you are reading a poem with craft and skillfully and competently, perhaps you're an actor, you know how to do it, but it doesn't feel as authentic. And conversely, you might be reading something that is really connected, perhaps though, and I've been to many, many readings where you can't really hear the poet across the room because they're not considering the physicality of their voice. And so it's a very interesting and frustrating place to be for me.
Have you read Holly Pester's essay on poetic voice?
Yes, many times.
That's it makes me think of that.
Absolutely. But it's interesting though, because I don't subscribe to either position. I think we need to, you know, I think it's very limiting to go, oh, you look at it through the lens of the performing arts, not even performance actually. And you want craft and you want competence, or you look at it through a kind of almost an anti-craft stance of like, you know, underground experimental contemporary work, but then you might not be able to hear the person across the room. And so the physicality, what happens in the space, is lost.
Yeah.
So, you know, what can we do to
But I think it has something a little bit to do with our culture. And I mean, like, you know, largely like our culture, meaning like Western industrialized culture, an obsession with book production in terms of what literature is. Because we know poems come from song and poetry has origins in sound. Like, so that is part of the poet's craft is in reality, right? Like, not only and not absolutely, but we're so used to reading in a solitary sense that maybe something a bit is lost by this, like forgetting this tradition, maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, and also is that the idea that is recurring and so ancient that reading and writing are disembodied, that I find
not true.
so untrue. And so even reading silently, like you're telling me that when you read silently, you don't have a voice in your head? That's not true.
No.
So the breath system is not responding to that experience. That is not true.
No.
I don't think that's possible. We might describe it differently. We might have a different sense of what is happening, but I don't think that is true. So I think that, yeah, that is a very damaging lie that is still very present and pervasive.
Yeah, it is extremely. I think there's an American scholar, Eleni Stekopoulos, and she just has a new book out too, and she writes about the power of language to heal. And in her first book, she talks about she quotes a lot of things. I'm pretty sure it's Novalis when she says something like, "The poet is the ailment and the cure." But this, I think it's language. It cuts us open, but it also we can heal ourselves with it, I think. And I mean this in a metaphorical sense, like the way we treat each other with language and the uses and abuses of language, but also the physical acts of language, and using our voice. Like as someone who works with the voice, you know the power that voice has to actually heal us and express things that the voice can express things that are much further beyond the semantic realm as well. And I don't think that's outside of poetry at all. So
if it was outside of poetry, then we should not be considering ascenic writing poetry. So I would argue that's not the case. Can I be a little bit annoying and interrupt a little bit the flow of this amazing conversation that we can go back to invite everyone who has questions or comments to please intervene, either by opening the microphone or writing down the questions in either Portuguese or English or Italian even, and we can work on translating it and have a conversation with our speakers. And I will take total advantage of the fact that I am facilitating this event to drop down few intuitions, because I love the use of this word by Serena. And I will be, despite being super interested myself as a poet and a translator, I'll try to stay in my more academic role to say, first of all, I was just rereading Carmen Maria Machado, Her Body and All the Parties. In the first short story, she says, if you're reading this out loud, please imagine my voice as and blah, blah, blah. So once again, yes, we do have voices in our head, as you were saying, in my opinion, at all times, and it's very relevant. And when it comes to poetry in particular, I like to quote Edoardo Sanguinetti, one of the most renowned experimentalists of Italian second half of 20th century, when he used to say, if a poet cannot read out loud their poems, it is because the poems ain't good. Mostly so. I'm just gonna leave it there. And I'm just gonna give a couple of more things that I thought about, picking up on certain things you quoted or slightly quoted. I'm thinking, for example, of the fact that you used the word no borders. You were referring, I guess, to La Frontera Andaluzia. I don't want to mispronounce it, but like I think we were thinking of that. And I wanted to respond to you with a quote that I managed to find, but not sure where from. It's by Edouard Glissant. And it says, the contemporary writer, the modern writer, is not monolingual, even if they know only one language, because they write in the presence of all languages, which I think that is a concept that can be very complementary to your idea of self-translation as producing a new sort of object in certain ways, but still with this connection and links that cannot be erased, and we don't want to be erased, as probably Alison was highlighting. And then the last, and I promise mi taccio, as we say in Italian, is just a comment on a philosophical perspective that is very dear to my heart. That is, of course, the feminist perspective on what it means to embody a piece of art. So in this case, being a body that is projecting, and I'm thinking of the projecting verse that I had a chance to discuss with Alison in the past, as a body that is at least read as the body of a woman. And I was thinking of the amazing book by Adriana Cavarero, A più voci, in English translated as For More Than One Voice. And I found a few lines that I wanted to share with all of you as part of the description of the book in the English version that talks about the devocalization of logos as the invariable privileging of semantique over phonè, mind over body. Female figures, from the sirens to the muses, from echo to opera singers, provide a crucial counter-history, one in which the embodied voice triumphs over the immaterial semantic. So I think that also kind of goes back to the last questions you were answering to Alison and attempt at my first initial comment. I don't know if you were familiar with this book. If not, like I would totally recommend you to read it. I think it can be very helpful in sustaining not really your thesis, but your own research also as a practitioner. And on that matter, I would also say, before or after other people intervene with other questions, I am very interested in your work as a practitioner, but also a teacher of voice, as in voice is so strictly connected to your poetry. But I wonder, since we are in a situation of interart and intermedia, how linked, how close, how much one on top of the other these two areas can be imagined and combined? What is the difference? What is in common? Where does it spread out a third object or a third area in which the two coexist? I don't know if it makes sense, just intuitions.
Yeah, completely. Thank you, Marzia. Yeah, I mean, the Cavarero book is one of, yeah, I've read it many times, and going back to it, and it's actually something that I use even in a very, very simplified, extremely simplified way when I work with my students about on the sense of uniqueness, which again might seem like a facile concept, but it is crucial to their understanding of themselves, especially when going into performativity and playing a character and understanding that, and understanding how, you know, the negotiation between the self and the self that is constantly in performance, if you will, but and actual mediated and scripted performance of different selves. What was the second half of your? Oh yeah, about so the teaching link. I mean, that is also a massive kind of topic of conversation, I think. Again, thinking about given circumstances, and to use an acting term, but like, you know, my actual life circumstances, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make space for my thinking in what feels to be the wrong field, in a way, meaning the wrong side of the divide, perhaps. Because I'm deeply interested in performance work for writers and poets, and in considering and as Alison was saying, it should have never been divided. It's crazy to think it can be divided. So considering the body, reclaiming the body, and I think, as I said in my presentation, my voice practice has changed my writing practice 100%. It is in the voice memos, you know, the way that sometimes I start something through voice and by voice, and I don't even know what it is. And so there's no page, you know, in that moment. Although there needs to be a page at some point for me. And I think that is completely subjective. I know that there are quote unquote performance poets who don't use the page, you know, they might compose entirely through the voice and recording. And it also, the editing, so what I mentioned, also the editing out loud, which is 100% not something that I invented or any, you know, but it is something that I had not considered before. I wasn't doing it. And now I even do things that, I mentioned it to another poet, I can't remember who it was, and they were horrified. So sometimes I would have speech, text to speech on my laptop, read, if it's a long prose thing, like the novella I wrote, I have the AI voice, horrible voice, read it out. And it is, of course, a crazy thing, and it feels wrong, and it sounds strange, but I still need, because maybe I'm tired. I can't be reading an entire, you know, 40,000 words by I can't do that. So I would have it in the background, and it is crucial. You can't, there are things that you don't see, that you don't feel with your eyes. You miss it. You just miss it. So yeah, to me, it's very simple. There needs to be a testing through voice of whatever it is that I wrote. Without that, so that is now absolutely a big part of the way I write. And I don't think I would have arrived there, I would have gotten there, at least not in that clear-cut way, if I hadn't done my voice training. Yeah.
Any question from the audience? Because otherwise I can keep going on forever and ever, and I would not recommend it. Please, Manuela, if you want to turn on your microphone, feel free, or
Yes.
write it.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay. I want to thank you so much for the very interesting and beautiful talk and poetry, and also for the questions that are being made. I only wanted to say that at my point of view, the physicality of voice is always mingled with affect and temporality, the feeling of temporality. And for example, when you have, my English is off, when you have in your first poetry in Italian, when you said alb lente la mano langore, tutto questo we heard lento and dolce, but the other temporality in Italian was much more fast, was much faster than in English version. So I think it is very interesting to feel your relationship with time and movement and affect and physicality in both languages. And the feeling of time, what I heard was different in English and in Italian. You were, perhaps I would say, a little more nervous more agitated in Italian, with exception of these Petrarchian moments of lento, la mano, l'angore, but the other thing was more staccato, I would say, and this was very interesting. Each language is a mode of existence. It was very interesting to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. That's such an interesting way of putting it, I think. Yeah, well spotted also. I feel very, it feels very vulnerable to read in Italian. I feel very rusty and I feel very exposed. Despite, you know, readings, I do readings all the time, so I normally don't get much stage fright. But absolutely, you spotted it right. And also I think, yeah, it goes back to this sense of breathing and the rhythm of a language and the musicality of a language that is different to begin with. And the breathing pattern will be different, therefore, because the breathing responds to the speech in that way that we were discussing earlier. And so, but what you made me think about is my own relation to a sense of temporality and rhythm in the two languages. So thank you. Yeah, for noticing that.
Thank you.
On the matter of temporality that I think Manuela Toscano like really managed to point out, and remembering that at some point when you were commenting on your own creation, you said, I had to insert some blank space to make audible way of breathing through. And I was thinking not just of the amazingness of verbi vocal visual poetry that allow you to have a sort of a script on the page that makes it understandable how you can imagine the performer do it if you never had a chance to encounter them, but also how there is a personal perception of time during a performance. You have lots of practice in it, but for me, for example, pardon to make it personal, but I get very agitated, and sometimes when I shut up for a little bit to let the verse sing, I feel like I'm taking too much time from the audience, and I miss the chance to be in touch orally rather than just orally. I don't know if I managed to pronounce it like in a way that embraces the audience rather than just being speaking to an audience. And I think that's a great point in your performance that should be embraced by many other poets, because it allows you, not just in the context of poetry, but in the context of like active listening of each other, for example. So I think it will make the world like a kinder and nicer place to live in, with the bonus of poetry. I don't know, maybe I'm just being naive.
Yes.
Manuela, you wanted to say something?
No, it's what you said is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is very interesting. The sense of like thinking of craft and anti-craft and bad, bad reading. It is this sense of like time definitely is elastic in performance. It's hard to explain the way that time kind of speeds up and slows down, but there is definitely a sense of like allowing your own breath to exist in order to connect. And of course, today, you know, it's incredible that I feel the warmth and the energy through a screen. But reading through a screen is, as I'm sure you know, because you've done it, it's really difficult. It's really difficult not to be in that space with other people and with the audience, which is normally something I really use. Again, it's an obvious thing to say, but it is one of the best feelings there is, actually, encountering an audience that way, I find, and allowing for pauses and yeah. And I think I'm just thinking out loud at this point because I have so many thoughts. I feel like I need to go and kind of, you know, decompress. But thinking about authenticity and lack thereof, and I also feel that there's a tendency to go binary in that way as well. So I normally encounter, this is just anecdotal, but I normally encounter either people who go, you know, other people who speak or write in a second language, and normally the second language is English, as we were saying, because English is the hegemonic language of our time. But they would say either I can't really express myself in English, and so how can you? So the assumption that my writing in English cannot really be authentic or mine, or, and that is the one I'm often guilty of, positing that there's freedom only in the second language. The second language is free from history, from family history. It's free from, you know, it's which is also not true, by the way. And yeah, I do feel that we need to work to make, to undo this sense that it can be one or the other. And also thinking of temporality in a different way, not in the moment perhaps, but thinking of a longer duration. I do think there's a lot of value in allowing yourself to change, to change your mind and to, you know, develop. And because I'm very bad at that, not just personally, but also kind of in my artistic practice, let's say, I tend to go, okay. So for example, I had written and published some stuff in Italian when I was younger. So I was like, I can write in Italian, but only prose, not poetry, because poetry is only English. You can't, don't you even try. And it's like, why? What is that? But then at the same time, you do try to create your own rules, to make your own rules, because you need to. At least I do. So, you know, it's tricky. It is tricky.
I'm gonna complicate maybe the question a bit more on temporality, but I was thinking, doesn't Rita Felsky argues that the body of people with uterus tend to have a more cyclic perception of time? I think that is not a biological thing, honestly. I think that we can see it lots in the concept of revolt for queerness, for example. But the fact that temporality as a chronological understanding of successive events, it's a very male-dominated perception of how history develops, and that there are other ways of perceiving it. And I wonder if this could be interesting for your research in terms of how these affect the concept of a hic et nunc given by a performance when your temporality goes in circles somewhat rather than linearity. I have no answer, and I don't expect you to have an answer right away, but if you do have some thinking, I'd be happy to hear about it.
You made me think of, but I can't remember who it was by, so I need to find it. But there's I believe it was in poetry, in the Paris Review. There was a very good essay about forms of plot and different, you know, the rhizomatic, the linear, the non-linear, which, yeah, I'm definitely going to go back to thinking about this. And again, you made me think about the you know, the trope. It's not even a trope, but the kind of folk knowledge of the 7 years cell regeneration, and, you know, all the different cycles that we think about and that we use, and that we use to map our lives out. I personally, for example, love New Year's Eve. perhaps I'm the only one. Everybody hates narrative. I just am a sucker for anything that is a sense of renewal and you know, and a sense of going around and then start again, anew, or just different. Yeah.
It makes me think of when Marti was saying this idea of different times, and now you're saying you like the idea of renewal and circular time, let's say, or something that's recurring. I was just thinking of your poetry because it's not narrative, right? Like I wouldn't define what you're doing as narrative poetry by any means. And I wonder if there's some kind of connection between the mode of composition, the interplay of language, and the relationship to time. Like if this, you know, because I agree with you, words in second languages, third languages, they develop histories, we make their histories over time, different histories. And I wonder if there's something happening with the collision of the histories of your words that disrupts an idea of linear time. It's an open question. Both of these comments from Marta and yourself really have given me a lot to think of.
Thank you. I like the way that you put it, the sense of collision. I have never considered this the narrative or the no-narrative aspect of my poetry. I do often have characters in my poetry, but not necessarily narrative. Like persona, I guess.
And then what defines narrative, of course, is like another question.
But I know what you mean. I also think, I'm very, very grateful for today and our conversation, because you all helped me so much think about my own work, and developing a thinking around your own work, which is, it's very interesting when it connects to others, and I find it incredibly valuable. So I just wanted to thank you again.
Thank you, Serena. I was trying to break the ice a little bit with the rest of the people listening to us, but it seems like no one has the urgency of asking any more question. But I'm sure that Serena would be happy for people to get in touch if they have like further questions down the line. I personally don't want to wrap it up earlier. Can I take advantage yet once again for a very, very, I promise, last question? But since you were talking about intermediality, the difficulty of reading through a screen, and yet somewhat, I guess, still feeling the audience partially in a certain way, because we had to get used to it with COVID and quarantine, etc. It made me think of, have you ever worked, and actually this is a question for Allison too, because I'm not aware of it. Both of you, have you ever produced, or would you ever consider producing video poetry?
Like just video?
Video poetry, as you prefer, as a recording of you doing a reading in specific ways, or like your words going while a video goes on. I don't know, there's many ways of doing video poetry, but
I kind of did it once. I did something like that once. I guess it was like a prose poem kind of text, and it was a video that it was basically just a family like archive. So it was like looking into my own personal archive, and I was reciting as I looked through it. So yes, my answer is yes.
My answer is yes too, as in I would definitely consider it. And I've done, to call it video is a bit of a misnomer, but I definitely have used my own recorded voice, and I really like actually that clash and collision of recorded voice and real live voice, which is still mediated through a microphone anyways. But I like, and it's the same voice, it's the same body, but it isn't the same. And so there's kind of that eerie or that interesting space. So I have doubled myself in live performances, speaking over my own recorded voice. I've done that a few times. And I also used video where I would have the text kind of scrolling on the screen, and doubling as well. And I also did the performance inspired, the live dubbing thing, which I did in Milan last year, which is an alternative dubbing of a scene, which was from The Human Voice, the version with Ingrid Bergman. And so I live dubbed Ingrid, which was a lot of fun. So I'm definitely interested in exploring kind of other media. I'm completely technically incompetent, so that is a bit of an obstacle in terms of making my own, videos and stuff. But it's definitely, I am interested in the body mediated, definitely, and especially in the live moment, what that does in the space.
Thank you so much. I kind of wanted to stretch it a bit more. Like, we had some interartistic presentation. There was also intermediality, and I was like, let's push it to the limit, go through almost to the cyborg of Donara way in my own mind. So I think we're running out of time, but thank you so much for your presence, both Serena and Allison. Thank you to my fellow co-organizer for being here at this event, and everyone who participated more or less actively. It was a pleasure to know you were here with us, and we hope to see you next month with our next event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Serena. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Mandir.
Thank you all.